I would say the show's about everything that's happening during our COVID times, especially as artists. We like to be in person, but we're being isolated, we're alone. So I wrote about isolation, I wrote about loneliness, and a lot of my other creators also had similar themes, and a lot more.
I would say the show is about anger, it's about isolation and uncertainty, but it's also about hope and looking toward the future and trying to see if you can make something good out of a bad circumstance.
Ultimately, I think the show is about expressing one's identity while in the face of adversity. I also think that this play demonstrates how we can affect change in the world just as easily as as the world can affect change in us. Some recurring themes have been isolation, freedom, change, and art.
I think this project is definitely about the artist's response to everything that's happening in the world and to change and isolation and the fear of the unknown future and how everything will get better and you just need to follow your heart.
I would say the show is about these portraits speaking like how we think they would react in our time and what we're dealing with. And recurring themes would be isolation and fear, but also strength and rising up.
So like a lot of people, I definitely do see this as the artist's response of COVID-19 and of quarantine, and just the very human relation of all of these portraits are all in these different worlds with their different struggles, but there's something very human about all of them that kind of pulls them together and makes a very cohesive narrative. And a lot of recurring themes, like others have mentioned, it's a lot of fear, a lot of isolation, but also a lot of hope, a lot of looking to the future and seeing what's to come.
I feel like the show's about humanity. It shows anger, dread, but it also has isolation, but it also shows rising up, change, and individuality.
I think the show is about there's pain, there's isolation, there's fear. But on the other side of that, there's hope and there's creativity coming out of this situation. And
I would definitely say that the Portrait Project is the artist's response to COVID-19 with a hopeful future through the lens of famous portraits, exploring themes such as uncertainty, pain, and self-expression.
And I think the show is about the artist's adaptability and creativity coming out of dilemmas such as isolation and just feeling hopeless, but the hope that can and creativity that can come from that.
It's been very strange. It's been a little bit stranger for me. I'm actually in Vancouver and the rest of my classmates are all in Saskatchewan. So I had to have a bunch of stuff shipped out to me. And I actually got a budget and I was able to go and buy a few things that I needed that would have been too large for them to ship to me. It hasn't been that much different than any of the other classes I've been taking online, but I had less resources than someone who could pop over to the university to pick up what they needed.
Working during the pandemic was really weird. I felt like kind of it was less real in a way than an actual like physical production would have been, but it was also really educational because like I had never done anything really with lights or like setting up like a backdrop or anything like that. I had basically just acted, so I got to learn about a lot of stuff that I wouldn't have learned about otherwise, so that was a good experience.
This experience working on an artistic project in the pandemic was surprisingly really enjoyable for me. I found that this project was the thing I looked forward to during the semester and the pandemic, and it reminded me of the importance to use art to help ourselves and each other through difficult times.
Working through the pandemic was definitely a 50-50 of having a lot of support but being alone. Because we did everything in our houses, usually by ourselves or with the limited people in your family to help. You could take the advice that our castmates and our directors could give you, but you really had a lot of pressure that I didn't usually feel in a full-fledged production.
For this play with the pandemic, we got to work individually with like a specific writer and with the people making costumes and props. So we had a lot of control over what was happening, but since it was so individual, we didn't really get to have the cast coming together and feeling like we're a cast all working for the same goal. So that was unfortunate, I think.
As a first year student, and this being my first experience with the university and my first show with the university, it definitely was very new. Like I've been in the audio booth, I've been behind cameras before, I've been on stage before, but being the one who has to orchestrate it all, with help of course, but it is still a very new and a very foreign experience. I've definitely learned a lot, but unfortunately there it does come at the expense of some other things, some people have said prior of being as a cast, as being part of a crew. But all in all, it has been very eye-opening and very interesting and very educational.
For me, it was the process. It was very different from what we have done before. Definitely feeling weird acting to myself to a front of a computer screen towards like a bunch of the castmates. Also, just being by yourself and learning how to set up lights and put up the background and stuff like that. That was definitely weird.
This has been really challenging and interesting project. On the positive side, I did get to learn what it would kind of be like to act in film rather than on stage. And, you know, learn all the lighting stuff and sound stuff and working with a camera and all that kind of thing. That was interesting. But I still prefer being on a stage, having an audience there in the room with you and working with a team of other actors.
How was the experience of working on a project like this? I found it really, really liberating to be able to write like my own work and still do a type of production during a pandemic, because a lot of people aren't really afforded that kind of opportunity. And I feel like we were very lucky to be able to do that. I found it a little more difficult to kind of keep myself motivated, as a lot of people do struggle with a little bit of mental illness, especially during a pandemic. But I did find it really interesting and eye-opening to see all the working parts of a production firsthand, having to set everything up.
And for me, I think it's the most heartbreaking thing is that we don't get the same type of cast and crew like hangouts and like camaraderie, and we just don't get that in the same way. But I still felt very supportive by my fellow students, by the creative team, and it was a wonderful opportunity to try a bunch of different fields that I normally wouldn't do in a production, like helping with props and lighting and cinematography.